Hey, what's up? It's Jesko again from AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. I've got a really special episode for you today because I'm joined by studio designer Carl Tatz. If you've been in the studio design world for any length of time, you'll probably have heard of Carl and his revolutionary phantom focus system. Carl's been at the forefront of studio design for decades, and he's worked with some of the biggest names in the industry. And today he's here to drop some serious knowledge on us, because we're diving into one of the most debated topics in studio acoustics, and that is room treatment versus speaker tuning. Which one really makes the biggest difference to your sound? Is all that foam on your walls really doing the trick? Or should you be focusing on dialing in your speakers perfectly? Carl's going to share his expert insights, practical tips, and maybe even challenge some of the most common advice out there. Whether you're just starting out setting up your home studio or you've been tweaking it for years, you'll want to stick around for this one. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll have a whole new perspective on how to get the best sound out of your room. But real quick, to help you out on this journey, I've created my home studio treatment framework that you can download for free at the link in the description. These are my 5 steps to systematically treating a home studio and getting it to translate. So if you're in the process of setting up your new studio and you're wondering what steps you actually need to take and in what order, what to focus on, and what you can ignore, I really want you to check out my home studio treatment framework. It's a simple step-by-step process, very top level, that I compiled for you so you know exactly what you need to do to take your room from empty to fully treated and getting it to translate. So it's all in there: how to set up your speakers, how to find your listening position, how to work with porous absorption, how to work with resonance absorption, how measurements come into play, speaker calibration, but also smaller things like speaker decoupling, and then obviously also when to include a subwoofer. It's all in there, laid out nicely for you to follow in a step-by-step process, so you know exactly what to focus on at each step of the way. So if that's you, make sure to download my home studio treatment framework at the link in the description. All right, let's jump right in and learn from one of the best in the business. Carl, thanks for joining me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And yeah, thanks for taking the time to talk to me.
Same here, Jessica. Looking forward to this as well.
Sweet. And the question that I really want to start with, because obviously you're known for the phantom focus system. In the context of stereo sound systems, what is the phantom center?
Well, it's nothing I invented. It's I think it was first discussed in the 60s when stereo came out. And it's the oral illusion of there being a center speaker when you have speakers set up correctly, symmetrically, hopefully in a 30-60 equilateral triangle. You'll give you the impression that there's actually a center speaker there. And usually it's the vocal, it's the most apparent. So that's what I know. I mean, is it, in our surround or ATMOS systems, we use a motorized center stand where the center speaker goes up and down, because it's disconcerting when there's actually a speaker there. It freaks people out because you swear to God that, sound is coming out of that speaker and it's not. So we put it down and it just feels better. It's probably acoustically better too because it's open.
Yeah, absolutely. And I found that it's funny how when people first hear a proper phantom center, just how real it is, just how plastic it sounds, or like how comparable it is to there being an actual speaker there. It's really quite incredible.
I mean, it's interesting you bring it up. I mean, that was the inspiration for my whole dog and pony show. Is that, I had a commercial studio for years, 18 years actually, sold to Sheryl Crow, greatest day in my life.
Amazing, yeah.
But it was, that center image I worked, so there's a whole history of how it all developed. We can get into that if you want. But yeah, that center image, that's the most impressive thing when you can get that right. And And it's more than just setting up the speakers correctly. Obviously that's what we do. By the time we do all our other magic, which isn't magic at all, but
Sure.
that's I just came up with that name. I think maybe as a joke at first. I said, well, that works.
Yeah. Sounds cool.
It sounds cool. That's all.
Yeah. People, and it's intriguing, right? People are like, whoa, 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 what is this?
Yeah, it's intriguing if it's not confusing. So I always wonder maybe I should have called it something else. But
I think it's a good name.
okay, well, good, thank you.
And then, I mean, maybe you know this, maybe you don't, but like it's definitely also an inspiration for a very simple speaker setup procedure that I developed, basically just based on hearing, has absolutely nothing to do with the Phantom Focus system, but I call it the Phantom Speaker Test, because it is based around basically
Yeah,
messing with the speakers until you get a proper phantom center, because that is a sign that you have proper stereo. Well, it's one of the main signs, right?
right. It's you've seen on the website, or you may have seen it on my website, the null positioning ensemble.
Sure, yeah.
And that's like basically the Bible.
Yeah,
If you can do that, you've got your imaging. You don't
yeah,
necessarily have frequency response, but you've got the imaging. And
yeah,
that's what
absolutely.
I've had people, engineers or students at a lecture or something, contact me and say, "Oh my God, I can't believe." And again, I didn't invent this.
Yeah.
It's just like I'm doing what I was told to do, by the gurus of in the back in the 60s. They figured it out.
I mean, well, I think this is well, it's a good transition to my kind of second question, very adjacent, which is when I did a video recently on what stereo is, and I did some research on when it was invented, it very quickly became clear to me that there is no proper definition of what stereo is. I mean, we now say, yes, two speakers, equilateral triangle, all this stuff, but there is no standard that was once written, at least that I could find, that says this is what stereo is. Maybe you could talk about that.
I don't know that much about the history. It started basically in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with all the speakers like AR and Scott and those speakers and those guys. One guy in particular, um, Roy Allison, he's the
Hmm.
one who discovered that when you put speakers on a stand, which is what we do all the time, for near field monitoring, there's cancellation, there's a floor bounce.
Hmm.
Um, and there's a huge dip at about 120 hertz, give or take. And nobody talks about this. And I thought, how come nobody talks about this? It's just, oh, I mean, there's no exceptions. You see it all the time. Occasionally, you'll see it maybe a little lower in a really huge room sometimes, but that's the single reason why everybody has a problem with the low end because they're not hearing it because of that cancellation. The only way you can't EQ it because it's too much. You can, but you'd have to listen to 30 dB or something because
Yeah, yeah. You
you're
just kill your headroom.
yeah, right. Yeah. So the only way to do that is with subwoofers, proper crossover, et cetera. Um, so there was a guy who sent me a link to this article on Roy Allison, who discovered that whole thing. And up until that point, it's called the Allison effect. But up until that point, I thought it was the Tatz effect because nobody
Okay.
talked. It was such a relief to have it verified, like, oh, I'm not the only one who talks about this because speaker manufacturers don't want to talk about it.
Yeah,
You never hear, you know,
yeah.
and auto correction things can only go so far with that because of what we just talked about. Even if they use subwoofers, they don't, it's not hands on like what
We don't
we
have
do.
endless headroom. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, the next thing that I'm really curious about, which is where the phantom focus system and your approach kind of fits into the history of control room design, right? So we've had this whole, well, over the last maybe 60, 70, 80 years, we've had so many different approaches to control room design, starting off with live and dead end, reflection free zone, controlled image design, non-environment, front to back, which is the Northwood Acoustics approach these days. Um, knowing all of this, seeing all of this, kind of which of those makes the most sense to you and why?
I don't think there's an answer. I think all of them work one way or the other. I think there may be some confusion or misleading that you can design a control room, with acoustic treatment and think you're going to have a frequency response like we have with the phantom focus system. It's impossible. Yeah, maybe NASA could do it,
Yeah.
but realistically, it ain't going to happen. I mean, comparatively speaking, our studios, our mix rooms suck, without the focus system, and we do it in other mix rooms also. But we've done so many. It's all very familiar. We don't get surprised very often. So the main thing is the sweet spot. That's what you're talking about. You want that to be the God spot, which you can do with processing. And people say, "Oh, you can't do that. It'll affect the rest of the room." Blah 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 blah. Well, if you're mixing, over on the side or back on a couch someplace, you need to find a different profession. You want to be in that sweet spot. That's where you want to be. That said, in an actual studio design, and most of our rooms are small, so the modes are going to be stronger than in a really large room.
Okay.
A few like that. We do things to ameliorate, the consequences of the modes so that it's not extreme. You're always going to have somewhat of a bump on the back wall, uh, typically you'll have a couch there. So if you pull out the couch out a little bit, it'll go away. You'll get away from that.
Yeah.
And as you walk around again, a small room, there's going to be places where it's going to be boomier than the other. It's my biggest fear is like, I don't want this to be terrible,
Yeah.
So that's why I do the things I do. So it sounds nice in the room, but it sounds, what I say to people when I give someone a demonstration, it's like, when you sit in the seat, you're in another room. This has nothing to do with the rest of the room. And, it might sound great. Oh, that sounds great. But when you sit in that seat, it's like, oh my God, and that's what gets me out of bed. That's the whole impetus for me. I go through months of agony, sometimes with these studios, but the moment when the client sits in that seat, and I see the look on his face, or he'll swing around and look at me, that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. I know what you mean. Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely. Can you give me a kind of an overview of like the phantom focus system and how that works and how that relates to the room as well?
Um, well, I mean, we do acoustic treatment of the room. We have, like you can see in the photos that, we'll have the front corners are basically bass traps with the subwoofers underneath, so that with a big thick membrane, so it doesn't go up into the sub. We
Okay.
want the sound to go out, but they're just freestanding. I mean, there's so much to talk here, but the subwoofers we place either facing a wall or facing down firing.
Okay.
Um, because if they face out, they might look better if they're going to be visible, but just keep in mind that the sound comes out and then wraps around and cancels
Hmm.
the wall. That's why if you face it to the wall, you get the biggest piece of meat. It's very obvious. I mean, you can try it yourself. You'll hear the difference. So that's one thing we do with that. And then the back wall is we'll do various types of what we call axial mode absorption that goes down to 20 or 30, depending on what we're doing.
And that's
Um,
using resonance absorption as well, or is this all porous absorption?
no, that's resonance.
Yeah.
It's a you know plywood, basically a sealed kind of thing, and then in front of that we'll do typical wideband, either 2-inch or 4-inch panels. Um, but I'm a much bigger fan of wideband absorption. But for something that low, you're not going to get it if you don't try, with the resonant thing.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to make it deep enough with wideband.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
the efficiency also drops. I mean, like, I guess you could technically do it, but you'd need depths for like 20, 30
oh,
hertz that are just
it's
so
unrealistic.
unpractical that they're basically not possible.
Yeah, well, there's some guy, I haven't seen much of him. There's some guy who had like these little thin things he put on the wall, and he swore that that was controlling that stuff. He had his whole show going on. It's like, okay, whatever.
Yeah, I think
Um,
the reality that many people or that is hard to accept is just how much space you need to use for low end absorption if you want to actually get it right. I mean, that's a kind of
yeah,
a reality we can't get around, right?
and that's fine because again, it's about the sweet spot. It's
Yeah.
I tell clients don't expect perfection. You can't afford perfection. You don't have a footprint for perfection, and even if you did, it's not going to be perfect.
Yeah.
You know. But getting back to your question, so that's my general thing. Make the ceiling absorptive, the back wall absorptive, the sides we use the acoustic lens, and they're
Yeah.
absorptive columns. So the lens is that the idea is that the speaker, the sound of the speakers, aims toward those walls and it brushes against that lens and it kind of catches it.
Okay.
So it's a combination of, and we use mirrors or, if it's a window, we go for visual symmetry also.
Hmm.
Um, so that, the acoustic lens is absorptive, diffusive, and reflective, a combination thereof.
Okay.
Uh,
What's the effect on the kind of the perception of the stereo image?
Well, you're just defeating the first reflections with it. That's the idea. And I think, if you just made it, totally absorptive, then it's not going to be as open sounding. Where
Hmm.
your ears are, you don't want it absorptive. You want some kind of diffusion or absorption, diffusion, ideally. It just feels more open. And again, with the mirrors, it's amazing. You'll have a room that might be 12 feet wide. And as soon as you put the mirrors up, it feels like, oh, it's amazing what it does. And people say, well, the mirrors, I mean, they're very reflective. They're not much more reflective than drywall,
Yeah.
Uh, but again, but when we put the mirrors up, you clap your hands. I mean, um, the flutter echo is, insane, of course. But as soon as you put those columns up, which are typically about a foot apart,
Yeah.
like it disappears.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Yeah, it's a simple thing like that.
And it's
Uh,
basically I'm gonna see if I can find a picture to throw in at this point as well. But it's basically a kind of it's kind of columns mixing absorption and reflection over maybe what 4 to 6 feet or something like that. Is that right?
it's more like 8 feet,
Yeah. But then it's
or
typically like a foot of absorption and then a kind of a foot of
no,
reflection, which is the mirror or
eight,
something like that,
eight,
right?
8 inches. The columns are 8 inches wide, and
Eight
then like
inches. Hmm.
then a foot. Sometimes it's wider. I mean, we do it 14 inches. It still works. Um, but it's anywhere from 8 to 10 feet long.
Right. Yeah.
Um, if there's a window, we try and get the biggest window we can if we're going to have a window,
Yeah.
because it just feels better. So then we just match it with a mirror thing on the other side. Um,
And I think
so
that's one of the reasons why your rooms also look so similar, right? I mean, I was going to mention that anyway. If you look at the projects on your website, the rooms look close to identical. And at first you might be thinking, oh well, this is the same room, but it turns out no, no, no. These are all different rooms, but there's a reason why they all look the same, right?
yeah, no, I mean you really hit on it. Is in back to what you and I were discussing before you started the video is that I used to reinvent the wheel every time I did a studio, and finally I just came up with this formula that was repeatable,
Yeah.
um, and worked. So basically, I'm selling Teslas with options. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
you know, and my clients will come up with ideas and like the stone you see on the front of a lot of my rooms. That was a client's idea, and I said, well, gee,
Yeah.
I don't know, and now it's people like demand it, or not everybody, but so I like it when somebody throws me a curve and adds something to it. But basically, you know, people, I don't have any competition. At least I present myself that way. In that, you know, go to the website. If you like the way those look, then I'm your guy. But if you want something else, I'm not your guy. In other words, if you want a Tesla, yeah, I
Go
sell
buy a Tesla.
Teslas.
Yeah,
Yeah. But if you want a Mercedes or a Ferrari, you need to go to, or a
that's
Ford,
right.
whatever, you need to go to those guys. This is and that's what I want to do. I've turned down stuff because I'm just at the point where I'm just old and cranky, and that's why this is what I want to do because it really worked. We batted 1,000 on it, so.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I think again, also this, just to kind of mention this, I think this is one thing that many people overestimate. We are working in a niche of a niche when we're talking about control room design specifically, right? And there, this is such a small niche. There is in comparison to other kind of industries, there's a handful of people working on this, and many times the solutions that we offer are things that we as a single person developed from our experience. And like you said, you do it this way because this is something that's repeatable and it works, right? And people want something that works, and so you need to be able to do
Product.
that. And this is the way that you found that works. And maybe another designer found a different way that works for him, and it might vary. Kind of subtleties might vary in some instances. It might vary quite a bit on certain aspects. But most designers do one thing, and that's it,
Yeah,
right?
and
Because
I
that's what they know how to do, right?
you can usually pick them out. I mean, I can recognize somebody's work right away because
Sure,
that's
exactly, yeah. Can you talk to me about like how your approach evolved? I mean, you already mentioned that you kind of you reinvented the wheel every time at the beginning. Can you talk to me about kind of the beginning days? What kind of things did you try back then that didn't work? When did the first kind of things start falling into place? How did your approach evolve to where we are now?
It started in my parents' living room. When they would go
Excellent.
out, my friends would come over. My father had some Scott speakers, which were a big deal. So we put one, it was to us, a huge speaker at that time. I think they had a 10-inch woofer, put one on top of the piano, and then we turned the piano bench upright and put that over there. So they were high. We'd get stoned and listen to Led Zeppelin
Sweet.
or um, Simon and Garfunkel or Nas, and that was my inspiration. Speakers were always like my thing.
Hmm.
Jumping ahead quite a bit, I had a commercial studio for 18 years, so the Phantom Focus system kind of started there. It wasn't the Phantom Focus system, but I went through, various stages where at one point I got a pair of like Dynaudio M3 monitors, big monitors,
Hmm.
and I knew they'd have to be tuned. So I brought someone in who is famous for that, and he did it, and I wasn't particularly happy with it. So I started fooling with, the angle and stuff like that, and then I had him back, and basically I had one cut that we went over and over again. I said, and I knew how I wanted it to sound, and I just kept telling him what to do because he had the software. So at that point, I realized, basically I tuned this thing, but I need to learn some sort of, analyzing software to do this. So that's how it started.
When was this?
Um, when?
Yeah.
Um, well, I still had the studio, so probably about 2000, uh,
Okay.
1999. Yeah,
Okay.
somewhere.
So no room EQ wizard. I guess smart probably wasn't a thing yet. Maybe they were just
Ah,
around the corner.
yeah.
I'm not sure.
Oh, this was Meyer.
Yeah, Meyer
They're
sound. Yeah,
old Meyer analog EQ.
sure.
Uh, that's what he used at the time. That's what I started using. Then realized, quickly, all analog EQs for boat anchors.
Yep.
Uh,
Basically useless.
yeah. So yeah, now it's so powerful. And we're about to make. I'm investigating making another leap here, uh,
Interesting.
which I don't really want to talk about
Okay,
until it
fair
happens.
enough. Okay, fair enough. We'll see what that is when
Yeah,
it happens.
yeah. Might just be a hop. I don't know if it's a leap or not, but we'll see.
Okay, well, I'm excited and looking forward to it.
Yeah.
When one of the questions that I keep getting, and that is really hard to answer, more than anything in this kind of the home studio space, right? People obviously converting their spare bedrooms, basements, garages, whatever, into studios, and they ask me, and they do something, they do some type of treatment, and then they ask me, is this enough? Am I done? And I found that is a really difficult question to answer. How would you answer that question? It's like, when are we done with treatment?
Um, well, I think there's a formula for that.
Interesting.
That
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can't think what it is offhand. I have a company called Oralex who custom make modules for me, but I think it's something like 50% of the room should be acoustically treated. Of course, that doesn't distinguish whether it's low end or mid band. So my thought is that you don't want to sit in the listening position, clap your hands, and hear the room. So I think you should err on too dead than too live, because
Yeah.
anything that comes back to you obviously is going to cause home filtering.
Yeah.
So like if you go into a room, I mean, my example is an empty swimming pool. You can learn to mix in an empty swimming pool. Eventually, your mind ear will figure it out.
Yeah.
It's not desirable.
Yeah.
Um, and your speakers will sound, even if they're near field and they're right in front of you, they're going to sound like they're 10 feet away because of all the tone filtering that happens with the reflections. So you just want to calm the room down. Um, low end, again, it's, the corners are a good suspect, the upper, like you have, what we call soffit panels, uh, get that. But it's, if people didn't have windows and it wasn't an aesthetic thing, it'd be nice to do um, some sort of wideband absorption on the side. There's some sophisticated ways of doing that, but it wouldn't look that good.
Yeah.
And the aesthetic is super important. You want to go in there every day and say, "Oh my God, I can't believe this is mine." That kind of thing. So there's compromises for everything. But to answer your question, the obvious things: grab the first reflections, and as you mentioned, the ceiling is just another wall. You want to grab all your first reflections at first, do your corners, but 4-inch 703 or Rockwell, whatever you're going to do across the corners. If you can, do the soffit things, and you want a cloud, you want the ceiling to be dead, and just do some sort of grab the first reflections, and the whole mirror thing, and everybody knows about that. You run the mirror along the side of the wall. It's a great way to do it. And then, don't have it totally absorptive where your ear is. That's not where the first reflections are anyway. So just maybe do a little, or you can just put some open spaces where your panels are. In other words, you could do very well just putting panels all over the place. But the bottom line is part of the answer to this is like, what you really care about is one position, is a sweet spot. Ultimately, that's it. That's where you're going to make your decisions, and that's a great gift. You don't have to get that freaked out. You don't tune rooms, you tune speakers.
Sure.
You know, so if you can get that sweet spot happening, and using the null positioning ensemble is a great opportunity, and also the that axle mode calculator that's on my website also. It's a really dumb, simple visual one. It's my favorite one.
I'll put a
Try
link
and
to it under the video for people to check out. I mean, in any case, your website will be linked under the video, and I'll put links to everything that we talk about in the description as well.
Um, yeah, I think that's valuable. Uh, and it's going to get you, you know, toward what it can be. It's not going to be a manual focus system, but it's going to be good. So, and what I tell people, use one of these inexpensive or like Dirac, not Dirac. That's really
Dirac,
complicated. Dirac is very complicated, I
very
found.
complicated. Yeah.
But by the time you do that, what's the very popular one?
Well,
Really, and
SonarWorks, Sound ID, that's the one that everybody uses in the home
yeah, yeah,
studio.
yeah. You're probably using it. Um, you
I'm
know,
actually doing it manually through my interface, but all the EQ
okay.
stuff. But yeah, yeah. But a lot of people do. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you have the opportunity to do it or the knowledge to do it correctly, as good as you can, it's better than nothing. And then there's the more expensive ones. By the time you go that far, you should hire us, because you know, we're going to come
Can
to
you?
you. We'll do it
I
for
mean,
you.
for people who are thinking about that, like, what are kind of the limits in terms of, for example, room size, space, in terms of speakers? What are kind of the limits to where you say yes, we can do this, or no, this is not going to work?
It usually works. We do them in bedrooms. They're just certain criteria. Again, what we just talked about, first reflections, back wall, some sort of cloud, that kind of thing. Um, and the way it works is the first dialogue we have is, once it seems like, they want to do it, is they'll send me photos, and maybe a drawing of the room dimensions. Hopefully it's a rectangle. Um, and I'll just pick out, well, I mean, we worked a lot of different ways. If somebody just wants to do a phantom focus system, then I just see what it is. Obviously, if it's a full-blown phantom focus mix room that's construction, it's a much, much more expensive, much bigger deal. Um, so I don't need to, surprisingly, I don't need to know as much. If it's somebody's existing room, like it was your room, you would send me, what's going on there, and I would say, well, that's all cool, but on the front, like for instance, I don't know what your front wall looks like,
It's a
but
big window.
but we want the front corners to be available for the subwoofers, because my whole subwoofer thing. Okay, so I'll give you my subwoofer
Please.
range. Okay, so if you hang a subwoofer from the ceiling in the middle of the room, that's a full space. So you get 100 watts, and let's just say you're getting 100 dB out of it. Okay, you drop it to the floor, suddenly you're in half space. You've effectively doubled, you know what I'm talking about.
Sure.
You've
Yeah.
doubled instead of having a 100-watt amp, you now have a 200-watt, virtual 200-watt amp with 103 dB.
This
Push
is
it to the
basically the boundary effect. Yeah.
front wall, it's now in a quarter space.
Hmm.
Um, Doubled again. So now you have a 400-watt virtual amp and 160 dB. And you put in the speaker and one in the corner, you get an eighth space, and you got a 800 virtual 800 watts and 109 dB. So we always use two subwoofers in the corners, um, because obviously for headroom reasons, but when you do that, it will cancel out the first and third axle null,
Hmm.
become out of phase with each other. The subwoofers
This
actually,
the side for like sidewall or side to side axial mode, right? That's the one you're
yes,
talking about.
yes, yeah.
Hmm.
It's the most important thing because everybody wants to be in the middle of the room,
Hmm.
and which is the worst place you can be. So
From a
that
from
helps.
a from a mode perspective. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, but everybody obviously want to be there because of the
Symmetry.
symmetry. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a beautiful thing that you can get that for free, but by using two subwoofers. Now that's the ideal. That said, if you only have one subwoofer, you put it in the middle of the room, it's going to go like this to each corner anyway. So you're going to get some of that effect. Or you have no subwoofer at all. The left speaker is going to react to the left corner. The right speaker is going to react. So you're going to have some of that attenuation. It's not going to go up like this, but otherwise people wouldn't be able to work at all. But that isn't the Allison effect. That's a different dip.
How dependent is this on the actual materials of the walls? Because obviously when we're thinking about this cancellation happening between two subwoofers, we need the symmetry in the response to be pretty much identical as well, right? So the left subwoofer needs to kind of see the same, the mirrored space of the right subwoofer. And if one wall, for example, is drywall and the other is brick or concrete, and then that symmetry is off, right? And like, what would you say there?
Well, ideally, they should be the same, but in an existing, space, it may not be. Hopefully, it's not a brick wall. At least there's something in front of it. But
Sure.
and sometimes, so what we do is when we do the tuning, we'll shoot each speaker. We don't tune each speaker separately. We just look at the the level, get the levels the same. You know, I mean, you could tune them separately, require, an extra channel to do that on the processor. So you can get them both. Oh, look at that. They're both perfectly, we've got them superimposed on the smart screen. But then when you mono it, it just goes to hell, So we just tune them as a pair, So this one might be doing, as long as we get the levels, the overall level the same, So we'll adjust that. That's the first thing we do. We get the levels the same, and then tune it as if it's one subwoofer, you know. That's
Okay.
the way we do that.
Okay. Um, let's talk about like front wall versus back wall. That's one of the things that I get asked a lot, right? I mean, I always say to some extent, well, look, it's in the end, they're all surfaces. They all kind of do the same thing. Yes, depending on where your speakers are exactly, they might react slightly differently because of the distances to the speaker. But from a control room treatment perspective, what are the differences between treating the front wall versus treating the back wall?
Well, I think if you make the whole front wall absorptive, it's going to deaden. You're going to suck the energy out of the monitors.
Okay.
That's why, it's good to have, we have a lot of absorption in the corners, although sometimes we have less absorption. It might look like it's huge absorption, but we might actually put a barrier behind it, so it's not as absorptive.
Okay.
Um, but the back of the room, you want it as absorptive as possible. You just want the sound to go like this, and you don't want it to come back to you. You're not
Yeah.
looking for ambience or diffusion in a mix room. In a tracking room, yes, you kind of flexibility. And the tracking room is so much easier because it can be crazy. You can just do whatever you want.
You can do whatever you want. Yeah.
It's
I mean,
wide
it's a
open.
complete taste thing, right? I mean,
Yeah,
recording room acoustics is whatever you want, right? It's like it's how do you want it to
yeah.
sound? Obviously,
It's either going to be too live or too dead. So, we always shoot for neutral, or if you want something lighter, depending on the size, you could have a little bit lighter by putting the drums in this place instead of this place, that kind of thing. But the control room's much more serious, it needs to be ideally symmetrical. Um, and as I said, on the dead side,
mhm.
air,
Yeah,
air, on, air on dead rather than live.
yeah. Because I mean, ultimately, like you said before, anything that comes back to your ear on top of what the speakers are doing, or the direct sound from the speakers is going to cause some sort of interference, comb filter, some sort of distortion, and ultimately we want to hear the speakers, and that's kind of the best. That's as good as it's going to get, right? I mean, the more speaker we hear, it's a
Yeah,
very simple
a
equation, kind of
straight
the
line from the speaker, ideally,
yeah.
you know. There can be extremes, like I say, if you put 4 inches everywhere, it would sound, it'd work, it's better than, the opposite, but it'd start to become uncomfortable.
Yeah, totally. One of the things that I've kind of been thinking about a lot, and kind of on a very top level perspective, is what's the role of the actual room in this, right? So we kind of already said, okay, the closer we get to just hearing the direct sound from the speakers from a engineering mixing perspective, the better it is. But then we don't want to sit in an anechoic chamber with our speakers either, right? So there is the room does play a role, but it is more, the more I think about this, it's more about just your perception of being in the room rather than its effect on the speakers, right?
Well, I think just to reiterate, you want some kind of reflection. You want some liveness on the front of the room, you know. And I don't know whether it's live end, dead end, whatever. I don't have an answer for what I do. It is what it is, but something like that. Um, but but when in a phantom focus system, the room disappears
Right.
because you're inside the apex of the sweet spot. So not only does the room disappear, the speakers disappear.
Mm-hmm.
It's just you're hearing the source.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever you're through it, you're hearing the source. You don't hear the speakers. And whatever you run through it sounds drastically different. It never sounds like the speakers, whether it's our speakers or somebody else's speakers. It never sounds like the speakers. That's the goal, and that's because of the tuning.
Mm-hmm.
The way that's the goal. That's the magic of it. It's not magic. All this is physics.
Sure. One thing talking about the speakers, one thing I've noticed in the projects that you posted, and I guess this is part of your design, is that you don't soffit mount speakers. They're always on stands. Is that correct? Or did
But
you ever
always
experiment with soffit mounting, or like what's your take on soffit
you
mounting
can
versus
see
freestanding
a
speakers?
couple on the website, and the reason that um, yeah, there's a few that are soffit mounted.
Okay.
But I think if it's a if it's a small room and we're talking near field monitoring, you don't have the luxury. You need to soffit mount them because you don't have enough space for the stands. Like you could
Mm-hmm.
look at this called the cockpit, a very small room. The front wall was 4 feet high, front wall,
4 feet.
and then 4 feet, and then it was 7.5 feet wide and 9 feet deep. It
Okay.
did have openings at the the backside walls. So there was no room to put stands in there like our Phantom Focus sound anchor stands. They're not going to, by the time you do that, you'd be outside.
they're,
Uh,
they're pretty
it
hefty,
made
yeah.
sense to soffit them. Um, I mean, obviously softening has a certain advantage. Um, it's a necessity. We haven't had to do that in a while, if I can think of. Um, and then, we've done it with big monitors too. Um, it's kind of a mixed bag. It's like some people think it just sounds better and not soffit mode.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing I don't like is when I'll see a picture. I saw one recently. They had some big monitors and they had them sort of like in an alcove, like it was just a cutout in a wall. It was like a soffit monitor, but it was just like in a shelf with
Mm-hmm.
space around it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a great idea. If you're going to do it, you need to fill it all the way around because the sound will
Yeah.
come out and you're getting distortion. But who knows? Maybe it sounds fantastic. You know,
Mm-hmm.
um, it was open to maybe they did that and they decided that sounded better. I don't know. Yeah, and another thing I've noticed is that one thing that helps is if it's soffit mounted, not to have them flush, have them stick out like a couple of inches.
Oh yeah.
That
Okay.
sounds better. I can't tell you why.
Interesting. All right.
There was one up in Aspen. Again, we didn't design the studio. It was a nice studio, but we did a Phantom Focus well, we did a dual Phantom Focus system where the mains and the near fields share the same low end.
Okay.
But we noticed that they were flush, and I said, these are going to sound better if we bring them out, and they did.
Mm-hmm.
And we brought, which was a real pain in the ass.
Which is why I don't recommend people do soffit mounting.
Oh yeah, well, yeah, no, but I mean, for near field monitoring, they breathe more. They're just
Yeah.
you don't want to do it unless you have to. I
Yeah.
think
Yeah. Yeah.
for that.
Talking about the other calculator on your website, the room mode calculator, I guess. Is that what you call it as well? How 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 important do you think room ratios, having good room ratios, is to the final result? I mean, there's a lot of debate about that. I obviously have my opinion, but what's your opinion about this?
Well, my mentor, or at least one of my mentors, my main mentor is Dr. Floyd Toole,
Sure.
who who is an interesting story. I mean, I kind of got into this when I closed the studio. I didn't know who I was. Like after 18
Mm,
years,
yeah.
that's was my identity,
Sure.
recording art. So what am I going to do? Oh my God. So I went up to Cedia up in Indiana at the time, and it's a huge consumer home theater kind of thing. I thought I was going to kill on home theater, and I've done a few, but they just don't do them in Nashville the way I want to do them, and it's a different animal. So I haven't done that many of them, but I'd like to. But with that question, I immediately thought of Dr. Floyd Toole because he thinks it's bullshit.
Yeah.
Um, it doesn't matter based on if you calculate, the nodes in the room and you place people and speakers where they're supposed to be. It doesn't matter. Obviously you have to have acoustic treatment, but I use it. I use it just as a security blanket of some sort. I'll look at and I'll just see, well, okay, this is what's happening here. Again, all these room modes are based on concrete bunkers, which nobody has. Who the hell knows what these walls are doing? Even the ones I build, they're pretty rigid, but who knows, how they're flexing or, so it's never absolute. Um, so I will use, I've used the RPG has one,
Hmm.
and then the one you use one too,
Yeah.
and
I keep using this one called Amrock.
yeah, I've I've done that, and I compare and contrast, and they don't always agree. Like
Really? I'd have
yeah,
to do that. I'd have to check that out. That's interesting
yeah,
because the maths
yeah,
isn't too difficult. I mean, should be the same.
yeah. But or maybe I'm just not using it right. But I look at that, and then I'll look at the axle mode calculator, so I'll know where things are. I'd probably rely on that, once the room is built, and I'll try and the question is like, all right, so if I'm going to build a axle mode absorber in the back of the room, is that do I calculate it by that or do I calculate it by the real wall behind it? You
Hmm.
know, this is pretty solid. I usually do that, the real wall behind it.
Yeah.
Um, um, so I use it and I kind of blur my eyes and kind of use the magic wand and I say, yeah, this is going to be perfect. Um, the thing is, the pin focus system is so powerful, you know. Um, it kind of, the 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 satellite, the speakers are rolled off very high. They're
Okay.
rolled off 120, where the old um, THX spec was 80 hertz.
Just
Well,
just
it's high because that's where the Allison effect takes place. Your
sure. The
speakers,
floor bounce. Hmm.
again, it could be 100, it could be 110, whatever, 130 sometimes. But, they're dying, so you're not hearing it at that point, you know. So it's already crossing itself over, you know. So that's where we want to fill it in. So if you do it at 80 hertz, you have this huge dip at 120, So that's the whole thing there. People don't realize that. Now you might have low end, you might say, oh, listen to that kick and bass, but you're missing this whole valley of information that's not there.
Sure.
So, and this is on the website, you mix and say, oh yeah, that's kicking, and then you take it out to the car and it's like, whoa, I got way too much low end. So you have to come back in because you haven't heard that thing, with the car speakers, you're hearing it. So you come back in, so you have to ration yourself. Like, hey, that sounds great. I better turn it down, which is sad. So that's what the band and focus thing alleviates because there's no more dips, there's no more peaks, within reason.
Sure.
It's you always dreamed, you could hear.
Well, listen, Carl, it's amazing stuff. Like we've covered quite a bit already. Before we wrap up, there's kind of one final topic that I'd like to talk to you about, and that is how do you feel about Atmos? I mean, you do Atmos rooms as well, installations as well. What are you seeing from your side where this is going? Is Atmos here to stay? Uh, how do you feel about treating Atmos rooms? Is it what are there any major differences to kind of treating a stereo room? Can you talk to me about that?
Yeah. Well, they say it's here to stay. It's kind of manufacturer driven,
Yeah,
between Apple and Dolby, and of course the manufacturers want to sell lots of all the gear, and on the one hand, it's people aren't even going to hear it unless they have go to the trouble of putting up that many speakers in their room, but it's hard to a lot of people don't know how to set up two speakers, never mind 13.
that's the thing.
Um,
Yeah.
so in some ways it's like 5.1 only worse. Um, because I was an early adopter when I had the studio, I was an early adopter of 5.1.
Okay.
And I've got lots of stories along those lines, but um, um, so there's that end of it. They're not going to hear it, with ear pods. You're not going to hear that's what they call spatial, or it's not Dolby. I mean, it's not Atmos, at least not yet. Whatever. So there's that end of it. To answer the other question, I don't treat it any differently than a stereo room.
Yeah.
Um, it's just a phantom focus. There actually is a phantom focus Atmos, you know, uh, protocol
Sure.
where instead of aiming all the speakers right toward the listener, we do what we do with the two channel is we put the apex in back of the, we shoot to the apex, and the listener is 1 foot in front of that, and 6 inches in front of the console. So it's 18 inches from the front of the console to the SNL position ensemble. Well, we do the same thing with the rears. So they're aimed a foot in front. And the overheads, the rear overheads are aimed to a foot in front, and the front overheads are, just like that. So it has that phantom focus imaging thing happening. So it's a little different. So it's more work. We've got one coming up in LA that just trying, we've done several now, but it evolves and we keep trying to do it better and easier, mainly, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. And
But
so
that's
in reality, it's more about what you do with the speakers than what you do with the room, right? Because in essence, the goal with the room is going to be very similar. You're going to try and reduce the impact of the room as much as possible. I guess the main part of the sound is still coming from the front, and so and the rest of it is what you do with the speakers, right?
Yeah, I mean, we've done a couple of different iterations. Is that people like the 67.5 inches from tweeter to tweeter of
Hmm.
the positioning ensemble, and they don't want to go wider. And we've done it where it's wider, like 78 inches. So it's a wider image. Um, and, it's hard to say. I mean, it sounds great either way. So, um, yeah, we'll just see what happens. I mean, but it's happening. They're driving it home.
They are driving it hard. I'm still very
Yeah.
skeptical, but we'll see. How do you feel about people using multiple monitors, especially when they
Oh,
stick them all together? Have like three pairs
yeah.
of monitors all stuck together,
Yeah.
three there,
Yeah.
three there.
That's a perfect topic for a fan focus system. Like, why would you want more than one set of monitors when you have
I
one
don't know.
that's accurate? You
That's right.
know, you know. Now, the only time it does make sense is if you want to hear what it sound, what your mix sounds like coming out of speakers. Yeah. So put them over on the side. Put a pair of whatever hi-fi NS10s or whatever you want to. NS10s are great in phantom focus system, by the way, but just put them over on the side so you can hear what speakers sound like, if that's what you need to do. And I've had a couple of clients do that.
Yeah.
And I've had some who had them up here and then they moved them, and it was the same thing. Oh my God,
Yeah.
what are different.
And
Um,
I also just think from an engineering perspective, you want more insight into the music, ideally, if you're using different speakers, right? It hardly makes any sense to have two similarly sized two-way systems set up in the same way, because they're going to sound different, but it's not going to tell you anything useful
right.
in that
Yeah,
difference.
you get two wrong systems. They're both wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Two
Well,
suboptimal systems, and
yeah, or you could have three wrong speakers.
yeah.
They're going to constantly change depending where they are. The room is king.
Well, listen, Carl, I think this is a good point to maybe wrap up. It's been super interesting. Thanks for taking the time, sharing with me, sharing with us. Thanks again.
Thank you, Jessica.
All the best.